Hi guys, I am back with a brand new topic, and for today we will be focusing our discussion on the Phillip's curve and the two expectations theory. So, are you ready to learn with me? If so, let's get started! In 1958, Australian economist Alban William Phillips of the London School of Economics plotted data on unemployment rates and the rate of change in wage rates between 1861 and 1957 in the United Kingdom, and it shows that there was a remarkably stable inverse relationship between changes in money wages and the unemployment rate. As a result, the concept of Philip's curve was born. The Philip's curve traces the relationship between two of the greatest problems of economies everywhere, inflation and unemployment. The Philip's curve is a curve showing an inverse relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. The reason it is acceptable to use the inflation rate rather than the change in wages is that wages are the main component of prices. At low rates of unemployment, labor has the market power to push up wages and in turn prices. However, when many workers are pounding the pavement eager for jobs, which means there is high rate of unemployment, labor lacks bargaining power to ask for raises. As a result, the upward pressure on price eases. The Philip's curve in theory. The first illustration shows the relationship between the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model and the Philip's curve. In part A, we assume that the aggregate supply curve, or AS, is stationary. Thus, points A to D represent possible equilibrium points depending on the location of the aggregate demand curve. As the aggregate demand curve increases from AD1 to AD4, real GDP rises from 6 trillion to 6.6 trillion. More workers are employed, and the price level rises from 100 to 112. The inverse relationship between the price level and unemployment in Part A determines the shape of the Philip's curve in Part B. Points A to D in both figures correspond. If the economy operates at point A, the annual rate of inflation is 0 and the unemployment rate is 8%. If the economy is at point B, the annual rate of inflation is 4% and the unemployment rate is 5%. Similarly, points C and D correspond in both graphs. In conclusion, changes in aggregate demand causes a movement along the stationary Philip's curve. The Philip's curve in practice. Early studies verified the Philip's curve for the U.S. economy in the 1960s. As shown in this illustration, the data fit the Philip's curve very well. Based on this evidence, most economists believe the Philip's curve was stable. The figure plots the inflation rate and unemployment rate combinations for the period 1960 to 1969. A freehand curve drawn through the points confirms very well to the Philip's curve. Then, just as the policymakers and economists became comfortable with the Philip's curve, the dream turned into a nightmare. As shown in this another illustration, the points for 1970 to 1990 show the Philip's curve in chaos. The pattern disappeared and many points moved far above and to the right of the 1960s data. At higher unemployment rates, the corresponding inflation rate was much higher than the Philip's curve predicted. For example, look at 1975, 1979, 1980, and 1981. This data reflect bouts with stagflation, which occurred in the 1970s and early 1980s. By 1990, the Philip's curve became unstable. Clearly, many points have been established upward and to the right. The inflation rate, therefore, can be much higher at any unemployment rate than the Philip's curve of the 1960s predicted. Thus, the Philip's curve theory was in shambles, as the nation simultaneously experienced both high inflation and high unemployment. Policymakers therefore turned their focus from the Philip's curve based on trade-offs to a misery index, which added the inflation and the unemployment rates. Now let us move on to the long-run Philip's curve. The simple idea of a stable trade-off between unemployment and inflation was an overnight sensation in the 1960s. By the early 1970s, the Phillips curve was becoming a has-been. Because Keynesian demand management policies generate the curve, it will come as no surprise that monetarists such as Milton Friedman and Edmund S. Phelps always believed the Phillips curve was just a transitory, short-run relationship. If the Phillips curve is vertical in the long run, there are profound implications for macroeconomic policy. Expansionary monetary and the fiscal policies can at best produce a short-lived lowering of unemployment. This is the so-called natural rate hypothesis. The natural rate hypothesis argues that the economy will self-correct to the natural rate of unemployment. Over time, changes in the rate of inflation are fully anticipated, and prices and wages rise or fall proportionately. As a result, the long-run Phillips curve is a vertical line at the natural rate of unemployment. Thus, Keynesian demand management policies ultimately cause only higher or lower inflation, and the natural rate of unemployment remains unchanged. Two versions of expectations theory explain the natural rate model. These theories sprang from the idea of whether expectations are formed adaptively or rationally, and is a hotly contested debate among economists. The first expectations theory is the adaptive expectations theory. The adaptive expectations theory is the concept that people believe the best indicator of the future is recent information. As a result, people persistently underestimate inflation when it is accelerating and overestimate it while it is slowing down. This theory assumes ignorance of future events, including changes in fiscal and monetary policies. People learn from recent experience and gradually adjust their anticipated inflation rate to the actual inflation rate. So in short, adaptive expectations theory is an economic theory that states individuals adjust their expectations of the future based on recent past experiences and events. The first use of adaptive expectations hypothesis was to describe agent behavior in The Power of Money by Irving Fisher in 1911, then later used to describe models such as hyperinflation by Philip Kagan in 1956. According to adaptive expectations theory, expansionary monetary and fiscal policies to reduce the unemployment rate are useless in the long run. After a short-run reduction in unemployment, the economy will self-correct to the natural rate of unemployment, but at a higher inflation rate. Thus, there is no long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. The second expectations theory is called the rational expectations theory. In the mid-1970s, Robert Lucas of the University of Chicago is credited with introducing this theory. Rational expectations theory is the competing view that adaptive expectations theory is too simplistic. Rational expectations theory is the belief that people use all available information to predict the future, including future monetary and fiscal policies. In short, rational expectationists believe that both nominal wages and prices are flexible. According to the rational expectations theory, people do not simply think inflation will be about the same next year as last year. They not only consider past price changes, but also consider how changes in the federal deficit or money supply will affect inflation next year. However, Keynes argued that we adopt the convention that expectations are held constant until we have a positive reason to alter them. Keynes specifically rejects the interpretation that an expectation is constant because there is an equal probability of a rise or fall in its value. He said that ignorance of future states does not warrant treating all deviations from current conditions as equally likely. According to rational expectations theory, expansionary monetary and fiscal policies used to reduce unemployment rate are not only useless but also harmful because the only result is higher inflation. Suppose businesses and workers predict that a surge in the money supply or a tax cut will raise the actual inflation rate to 6%. they will immediately raise their expectations of the inflation rate to 6%, even though the most recent rate of inflation was 3%. According to rational expectations theory, flexible wages and prices adjust immediately to negate predictable monetary and fiscal policy changes, so the economy's self-correction mechanism will restore the natural rate of unemployment. Therefore, discretionary policies should be abandoned, and fixed rule, stable policies to achieve constant money supply growth and a balanced federal budget are the best way to lower the inflation rate. The distinction between adaptive expectations and rational expectations can be analyzed using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model presented in this illustration. Suppose policymakers use expansionary policies to increase the aggregate demand curve from AD1 to AD2. Adaptive expectations theory argues that labor adjusts nominal wages sluggishly. As a result, the path of the economy is E1 to E2 to E3 with a temporary increase in real GDP to 6.5 trillion and lower unemployment at point E2. The theory of rational expectations is the competing view that the expansionary policy used to increase the aggregate demand curve from AD1 to AD2 is anticipated. Workers anticipate that the price level, or the CPI, will rise to 110, so they increase their nominal wages without a period of adjustment. As a result, the aggregate supply curve shifts from SRAS1 to SRAS2, causing the economy to move directly from equilibrium point E1 to E3. The result of Keynesian expansionary policies under both theories is that inflation becomes worse and there is no effect on real GDP or employment. Now we move on to our next topic, which is the incomes policies. Incomes policies are federal government policies designed to affect the real incomes of workers by controlling nominal wages and prices. These are economy-wide wage and price controls, most commonly instituted as a response to inflation, and usually seeking to establish wages and prices below free market level. Incomes policies have often been resorted to during wartime. Such policies include presidential jawboning, wage price guidelines, and wage price controls. The mildest form of income policies is jawboning. Jawboning is oratory intended to pressure unions and businesses to reduce wages and price increases. The government attempts to prevent or roll back wage and price hikes by appealing to labor and business leaders. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy called major U.S. steel manufacturers and convinced them to rescind their price increases. But President Kennedy jawboned with a club in hand. He threatened to sell government stockpiles of steel at lower prices. The president also informed the firms that those failing to cooperate would lose government contracts to firms that would lower prices. The second incomes policy is the wage price guidelines. A more formal policy to cool down the inflation rate is to establish wage and price guidelines. Wage and price guidelines are voluntary standards set by the government for permissible wage and price increases. The first systematic wage and price guideline program was initiated during the Kennedy administration, and this approach was also used during the Johnson and Carter administrations. For example, the Carter administration asked labor unions to limit their wage increases to 7%. Violators were identified in hopes that adverse publicity would force the unions to comply. Without any enforcement mechanism, the dominant view among economists is that guidelines accomplish little against self-interest. The last incomes policy is the wage price controls. So when guidelines have the force of law, the economy moves to a mandatory system of wage and price controls. Wage and price controls are legal restrictions on wage and price increases. Violations can result in fines and imprisonment. Once people believe wages and prices are under control by the law, the good news is that they expect lower prices. The bad news is that controls are government interference with market supply and demand. A ceiling price established below the equilibrium price will cause shortages in markets. This usually means rationing of such scarce items as gasoline. When price is not allowed to serve as the rationing device, consumers must incur higher opportunity costs by waiting in long lines for gasoline. This happened in 1979 when the government imposed a price ceiling on gasoline. Another rationing device is government ration coupons that give the right to buy a good. Ration coupons were used for many goods during World War II. Shortages also lead to black markets, which are legal markets for goods at unregulated prices. To enforce the system requires a government bureaucracy at taxpayers' expense. Long line for products, ration coupons, and black markets are not popular. This explains why wage and price controls appear primarily during war and rarely in peacetime. While such controls may be necessary under conditions of an all-out war, it would be folly to consider them as a solution to inflationary pressures that accompany high employment under any other circumstances. Although such controls may be unfortunately popular when they are in effect, the appeal quickly disappears once people live under them. The majority view is that controls destroy the efficient allocation of resources provided by the price system and intrude on economic freedom. Defenders of controls believe this is a small price to pay. That's it for today. I hope you do learn something, and I will see you soon with a brand new topic. Bye!